Hey, hi, everybody. Well, we're getting near the end of the semester. So I wanted to give you some solutions here that are institutional. I call this corporate self-management. So we're going to go over these three organizations, the ISO, WEEE, and RoHS, and what they do. Okay, so here we go. So first thing is that this is about how and tools that industry can use to self-regulate, and this is a wise thing to do, right? So why should industry be interested in this? Well, the first thing to understand is that most pollution is directly tied to corporate enterprise. So in other words, when they manufacture products they make the primary pollutants. You and I consume those products, and then at the end of life, we throw those things away. And then hopefully those things then go into the recycling stream, and uh, and if not, they become waste. So the companies never have to pay for those costs that then go on to society. So, but the key thing is that most of the pollution that happens will be in the manufacturing because they have to extract resources, process resources, use energy. There's the energy problems, all those things that we discussed that were part of the life cycle assessment assignment and lecture material. So the next thing is that there's social and legislative pressure on business to internalize their externalities. So in other words, what that means is that they should pay for the problems that they create. It, so things like waste, right? Garbage, you and I pay for that. Recycling systems, if they're weak, you and I pay for that, but they're the ones who made the initial problem. So internalizing the externality means they pay for the problem. So, pollution is this cost to government. You and I pay our taxes and fees to government. You have garbage that's picked up, but that garbage is paid for via a fee that goes to, there's a difference between taxes and fees, which I won't get into, but uh, you and I make those payments either through our landlords or direct payment to the garbage company, or in the case of like San Jose, they add it to our tax rolls, property tax, and it's listed there. They do that. San Jose does that because it costs them less money to process stuff, and it just makes it an automatic system. At any rate, so industry can avoid legislation and they can avoid regulation when it regulates itself. So in other words, if you don't get into trouble, you won't be in trouble and you won't have to pay the consequences. Okay, so there is this thing that's called corporate environmental responsibility, or CSR, corporate social responsibility is another one. It's similar to that. So what is this? This is about managing the use of natural resources in an effective and efficient manner to reduce both environmental impacts and financial cost. So organizations can do this by incorporating actions to reduce or eliminate the environmental and social costs that are caused by their operations. So in other words, when they internalize their externalities, when they pay the cost of the problems that they create. And the reason for this is because the only language that an industry truly understands is threats to profit. And so when there's a threat to profit, they will take actions to maintain that profit. So they would do things like if they are responsible to pay for the pollutants, including the end of life on their products, then they will take actions to reduce the toxicity of products and improve the packaging so that packaging is recyclable. So then they end up working to maximize efficiency and productivity of the resources that it uses. They would work to eliminate or reduce waste and emissions. So that means air pollution, water pollution. And so they would therefore change some of their practices that negatively affect the natural resources of wherever they're consumed, for like in a particular country. So air pollution's reduced, water pollution's reduced, global warming or greenhouse gases are reduced, the destruction of habitats is reduced, biodiversity, right, stuff like that. Um, and um, and so the last thing that they can be working on is then also respecting, valuing, and rewarding employees. In other words, they create a culture where employees feel respected and valued. And then the employees will actually participate more to help move the company towards their goals, which is ultimately, again, maximizing profits. Okay, so why should this company, or why should a company, be environmentally and socially responsible? Well, because it bolsters their image, builds its brand, improves customer loyalty. It fits the growing expectations of customers and the employees, who are also much more environmentally and socially aware. So they want to see those values reflected in the company that they work for. And customers want to see that as well, because they're using what's called the dollar vote. When you buy something, you vote for it. And so oftentimes people will make choices because things fit their values. Okay, so that's going to end up boosting employee morale, makes customers feel better about the products that they buy and that they're supporting that particular company. And what all this also does is it inspires innovation from inside the company to develop longer-term immunity from things like legislative and regulatory actions. And so employees will do things to make their products in a way, and they'll look at the entire supply chain so that it will reduce overall impacts, right? So, capitalism has been evolving and society evolves as well. And so this era of social and environmental responsibility is now upon us. So what this then does is that it uses the power of business to solve or work towards solving environmental problems. Okay, so and then this, it's generally known as going green, right? And in doing that, the company can keep their costs down. So these eco-friendly actions, and that really means that they will do things that have less damage to the environment, can naturally trim operating costs when they reduce unnecessary waste, like waste use of energy and water. Then they reduce their cost. And by also reducing these problems, they avoid government fees and penalties, because government will assess those for when there's violations of things like local ordinances or state laws or even federal laws. So this happens quite a bit. Those of you that are interested in law may eventually get into that, or working with government. So the basics of this would be, of course, energy conservation, things like using LED lighting, recycling the materials at the business that they discard, using water-saving devices, and using other energy-efficient equipment. So if you consume less energy, you pay less money for buying energy. Many of them are moving to solar power, photovoltaics, converting sunlight into electricity, and then they reduce their garbage and waste, which means they pay less for that. So going beyond those basics would be improving the overall efficiency of a business. So that means things like they would improve the types of packaging that they use on products, so that the packaging itself is 100% recyclable. And there's other things too. They would also look at travel and transportation, how they transport things, or they themselves travel, to reduce the overall ecological footprint and cost. They would look at sustainable procurement. So they would look at their entire supply chain using something like a life cycle assessment, the LCA, to learn how to do that. And they might be part of the ISO, and there are many different systems which we're going to get into. So let's discuss these three institutional organizations, right? The International Organization of Standards, it's known as ISO, and yeah, that's weird. The O is after the S, but that's what they do, ISO. And then there's the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, or WEEE. Sounds like something you'd have fun with as you go down the water slide. And then there is the restriction of hazardous substances, or RoHS. And we've already covered another thing that institutions can do in agriculture, and that was fair trade. Okay, so the ISO comes from this word. ISOs comes from the Greek word meaning equal. And so it was discussed in 1946, which always seems to come up in this course because, that's when, after World War II, you had countries that met and they came out with things like the World Trade Organization, or it was actually GATT in those days, and the World Bank and the International Development Funds and all these different things. The United Nations came out of that. So these countries then met. You had delegates from 25 countries that met to discuss the future of international standardization. So that meant standardized details about things that they were involved in. I'll get more into that in just a bit. So a year later, it came into existence, and they had different technical committees that specialized in a particular area. So they had experts then who would work on this, not political people, but technical experts. And the ISO is located in Geneva, Switzerland. So the membership, there's many countries that are part of it. You can click on that link that I have here for you, or if that link's not working, you could, hopefully it still is, and you could look that up. But it's a global, so what is the members? It's basically a global network of national standards bodies. So there's many organizations throughout the world that create standards for different types of things. So standards on stuff like, a screw, right? How the threads are put in and how long it is and the width and that type of thing. So I know that seems overly detailed, but it's not. These are things that you and I rely on each and every day to have those standards well understood and used so that the products that we have work well. So there are industry representatives from about 156 countries, and that includes 110 developing countries that are also part of the ISO. And all of these, again, these people are experts in standards in their country, not political people, but technical experts. And each country gets one member, and so this is a good thing, because no matter the size or strength of the economy of a particular country, there's only one vote per member. So the ISO is an NGO, it's a non-governmental organization. It doesn't have legal enforcement authority, just agreements between its members. So the ISO, it doesn't technically regulate or legislate, it just creates standards for their members to then follow. So what do? Right? They develop and publish standards. They promote best practices in business, manufacturing, and environmental processes. So you might think, why is this needed? Well, I just said a little bit about that, but standardization makes it easier for businesses to compete in the global marketplace, and it improves work and environmental conditions. And the way that all this is, or why this is all needed, is because it improves efficiency for many industries that are all connected, and overall it reduces waste because they are using standards that make their products, that are components of their products, that are now efficient, right? If that makes sense. Hopefully it does. Okay, so they have technical and environmental standards, and they are, these things are all grouped. And so I'm going to go through, I'll mention a bunch of them, but we'll go over a couple in greater detail. So the key one, at least as far as we're concerned, are the environmental standards, and that is the 14,000 series. And so these are numbered, right? There's 14,000, 14,001, and then it goes, 2, 3, 4, 5. It keeps going on and on and on. So each standard has a particular number within the series. And the key thing for environmental standards is to help reduce environmental impacts and to reduce waste and to be, quote unquote, be more sustainable. Okay, so another key component within the 14,000 series is the EMS, the Environmental Management System. And what that does is that it maps out a framework that a company and organization can follow that they then use to set up an effective management system within their company. And the 14,000 series also includes a life cycle analysis. Okay, so hey, we studied that, so we know about that. But here's a place where technical standards to conduct an LCA are managed by all of these technical people. And what does an LCA do? Well, of course, it considers the impacts of a product or components of the product and the entire life cycle of that. So that means the supply chain. So we've also discussed supply chain. So we're putting all this together. And then the life cycle then goes from the extraction of raw materials to the final disposal of waste. And then what that does, as you know, as studying LCAs, when you use an LCA, it can be used to promote resource efficiency and cost savings because the LCA can identify where costs are high or where pollution is high, and then how to reduce or eliminate those things. Okay. So there are other groups of ISO standards. There's the health and safety standards, energy management standards, food safety standards, IT security standards, and there are many more. There's another link here that I provided to you. They call them popular standards. It's just really standards that are well used. So the 9,000 series for business is to help businesses work more efficiently and to reduce failures of products. So when products fail, then they get wasted. That means that all the efforts made through the supply chain are wasted, which means that all of that money is lost, and there's all that environmental damage that was created, all for basically nothing because of a failure of the product. That could be things like design failures or within the product that made it fail, for example. And then there's also the quality management systems, which is in the business series, and performance improvement guidelines. And there's also a fairly new one called social responsibility. That's the ISO 26000 series. And what it does is that it provides guidance to those who recognize that respect for society and environment is a critical success factor. So again, what this is, it's social responsibility. This ISO 26000 is a component of this, again, as I said before, the evolution of society. We have evolved and we expect social responsibility now. So it's increasingly viewed as a way of assessing an organization's commitment to sustainability and its overall performance. So let's go through an example here. So freight containers, yeah, I bet you probably haven't thought much about those, but you see them on the freeway. They're on trucks, and you see them moving on Highway 880 because the Port of Oakland is just up the road from us, and it's one of the largest ports in the United States. And nearly everything that comes in there are on these are in these freight containers. I've had the opportunity to actually tour that place a couple of times. And it's really pretty fascinating how much stuff moves through there. So the ISO has been very active with freight containers because freight containers have significantly impacted global trade. And my wife thought this was pretty strange, but I actually read a really good book on freight containers, an entire book on this, and it was really pretty fascinating. You think that there wouldn't be anything fascinating about a rectangular box, but there is, and that's because it helps move more freight more efficiently. So the standardization of freight containers is really important. And so the ISO created these standards for fairly standard freight containers. And what are those standards? They include things like terminology, so everyone's using the same language, classification, the dimensions, the specifications, how they're handled, how they are tested, and the markings so you can read them no matter what country you're in. Okay, so here's an example. This is from the ISO 1496 to 1990, and it has these specifications and testing requirements. So in other words, this makes it so that you can build these things that are not going to collapse or fail, right? And there's something as you know, you might think benign as a corner fitting, but the corners are critical because these things are stacked, so they have to fit, and they so that you need to have them all work well and work together. So standards then make it easier for business to operate because they can rely on these things. And the other thing, you know, it's kind of interesting about freight containers is that it used to take 108 workers 8 days to unload a timber ship. Now people can do it in 8 people can do it in a day. So there's efficiency. So for example, if we have a company that wants to ship 20 million units of Crest, you know, the toothpaste, to a customer in the United Kingdom, and if the boxes are shipped in a 40-foot ISO standard container, at a cost of $3,000 each, let's see what happens if you use these different options. So the old way was using pallets, right? The 48 by 48 inch pallets, and it would take 10 containers to ship them, to ship this 20 million boxes of Crest, and it would cost about $2,337. 9 pallets would fit into one 40-foot container at $3,000 per. And if you use the standard pallets, slightly smaller, 48 inches by 40, it would take 5 containers, half as many containers, to move those 20 million boxes of Crest, and the cost would be about $1,000 less. It'd be $1,236 at $3,000 per container. So you can get you can save over $1 million in 1 year simply by following these standards. Okay, so the ISO has these policy development committees. So there are 3 general policy development committees, and their job is to provide strategic guidance for the standards development work. So they help ensure that technical standards are aligned with the market needs, right, and the interests of stakeholders. And so there's these 3 here: Casco, COP, Polco, and DevCo. No, you don't have to know that for an exam. Just want you to know that there's committees for this. So the committees work with these basic goals: consensus, that all of the interests are taken into account, interests from manufacturers, vendors, users, consumer groups, testing labs, governments, engineering professions, and research organizations. So they want to get everyone to agree on what the standard should be. And it would be industry-wide, so they, which would include all those organizations. And keep in mind that these standards are voluntary, meaning that if you're a member and you have other members that have agreed to these standards, then you know you can rely on them. If they are not a member, you may not be so sure that you can actually rely on them, and that that they are. Your preference would be to rely on a company that meets the same standards and has the same standards that you do. So in other words, you wouldn't want something like a screw to be able to fit into something that you might have made or purchased another place. And if it met the ISO standards, you know that it would. Okay. Actually, I had a friend years ago bought a bunch of, he was making chrome spoked wheels for automobiles, and they did not use the ISO standards. And when he got these things, the spokes were too short and did not fit rims that he had bought from another source. So that meant he wasted all that money and he wasted all that material. Cost him a pretty penny. Okay, so there's different stages that they have for development. So they have a process. Processes are really important. So there's the proposal stage, a preparatory stage, committee, inquiry, approval, and then lastly, they are published. And here's some other technical committees. You can see these details I was talking about: screws, fasteners, bearings, pipes, paper, and many others, oils, plastics, freight containers we talked about, and symbols. So here's the publications. They have about, they published well over 15,000 international standards. And then how do they make this available to their members and others to understand and read? They have guidelines, documents, manuals, standards, compendia, handbooks, a catalog. They have a World Standards Services Network, and they publish 2 magazines. I don't think you're going to see those on the counter at your doctor's office or your dentist's office, but who knows, maybe you will. It's called ISO Focus, and it presents an overview of the ISO's activities and their management systems, and it comes out about 6 times a year or so. And then there's another thing they have, the ISO on ISONet, so that's the electronic version of reading about these standards. You may be involved in industry at some point in your life, and so this is really essential stuff to know about ISO. You could actually be the ISO person at your industry. Okay, so all of the decisions are referred to from the committees to the ISO members who meet in an annual General Assembly. Not such a bad deal, huh? You get to fly to Switzerland for a meeting. I want that. So all of the operations are overseen or managed by the Secretary General. He reports to a council, and the council is the one who develops the proposals that are put to the members who then vote on it. So it's very democratic. Okay, so they collaborate with partners in international standardization. So there's other organizations that are involved in developing standards, like the International Electrotechnical Commission. Yeah, I bet you've never heard of that before. And the International Telecommunication Union. So I just want you to know that there's this whole system out there in the world about collaboration between industry types so that they know they can rely and trust each other. So these organizations have formed this World Standards Cooperative in order to better coordinate activities and implement the standards of these international standards. So the ISO, together with these other 2 organizations, has built this strategic partnership with the World Trade Organization. So we've talked about the WTO. So here's a connection with the WTO. And it has this common goal of promoting a free and fair trading system. So in other words, you want to collaborate so that the specialized organizations within the WTO and even the United Nations, which they are also collaborate with, are all involved in harmonization of regulations and public policies. In other words, they're trying to create a singular language as it comes to standards, okay? And by the way, the ISO is also an institutional member of the World Economic Forum. So I want you to understand this global connection to work towards a singular group of standards. Okay, so you might ask, well, how do they finance? Why is that important? Because sometimes you want to know, like, well, who's really controlling things? It's usually the guy with the money, right, or the woman with the money, who's, or the company or the country is actually trying to use it or manipulate it for their own benefit. But actually, the ISO members all pay subscriptions that meet the operational cost, and it's paid by each member, and it's in proportion to the country's gross national income. So you would think that the United States, for example, would be paying more because we have a higher GNI. And then they have another source of revenue from the sale of standards. So the main costs then are borne by the member bodies which manage the specific standards development projects and the business organizations which provide the experts to participate in this technical work. So a little bit more about ISO 14000. It's a series of international standards on environmental management to help businesses perform better without damaging the environment. So it's been implemented in nearly all of their, and perhaps all of their members, and by nearly 800,000 organizations around the world. So 14,001 is really important because it helps organizations to better manage the impacts on the environment by their activities and to demonstrate responsible and clean environmental management. So it's about reducing negative impacts. Okay, so there are 6 key elements of the 14,000 series, and that's the 14,000 Environmental Management System Policy Management, or the EMS, the top quality procedures, an implementation guide, forms and templates that make it more efficient to collect data and manage data and compare data so that you move towards the singularity of standards, an audit plan and a checklist, and they have a training and awareness presentation that they also provide to other companies so that they can use that for their training employees. Okay, so, and then there's other details. I'm not going to get into all of them, but and maybe your eyes are glazing over when you look at this going, oh my God, do I have to read all that? But no, I just want you to know that there are all these details that are laid out by this organization to, again, facilitate communication and making sure that information is clear. Okay, and then here's another set of them. So let's talk a little bit about the EMS, the Environmental Management System. So it serves as a tool to improve environmental performance as well as provide a systemic way of managing an organization's environmental affairs. So it has 6 elements. There's the policy statement, a statement of the organization's commitment to the environment. Oftentimes you can find these when you go to a company's website. You can read about their commitment to the environment. I've read it on many, many companies' websites. And the other one is identification of significant environmental impacts. So this means they find out where their problems are, the environmental attributes or components of the problems from producing products and activities, services that they provide. There's a development of objectives and targets. So this would be environmental goals for the organization, like if they have first identified problems, now they have objectives about how to move towards solving those problems. And then you have implementation. And then the last part here would be the training of employees to make sure that they are aware of these problems and then capable of addressing their environmental responsibilities. And the last one is management review. So in some ways, as I look at this, I think it's also like how you write a research paper or how you really write a paper on anything. The first thing is identify, what the issues are, what the thing is about, what you're trying to do, where the problems are, how you plan on addressing those problems, and then the implementation, like actual who's going to do what or what needs to happen within the industry. Okay, so when you write a paper, it's basically what's the issue. Then you collect data, you organize the data, lay that out in your paper. And then the next part of that is you draw conclusions and you make a recommendation. And then you have an implementation, what needs to be done. Okay, that's just a hint of what you have to be writing soon with your final paper. Okay, so the another standard, the ISO 19011. So these are guidelines for environmental management systems, the auditing. So they actually have groups of people that will go from business to business from the ISO to audit another business make sure that they are complying with ISO guidelines. So the idea here is that by using this standard, organizations save time, effort, and money because they avoid confusion over objectives or environmental quality or audit programs. They secure agreements for goals. They work to reduce duplication of effort because when you duplicate efforts, you spend more money to do something that's already being done somewhere else. They look at audit reports and then evaluating the competence of the members. We want to make sure that people actually know what they're doing, that they're the right people in the job. So, why is ISO important? Well, you probably have picked up on this already, but it has a huge influence on global trade, and it can positively influence global trade in reducing poverty and reduce environmental impacts. More about the poverty thing a little bit later. And the ISO standards then influence a company to be more to be more efficient in production. I'll fix that real quick. ISO can persuade a sector to develop greener goods, so it's an incentive. It can make these policies and procedures and standards available in an efficient way so that industry can use them for their development and manufacturing processes where they make products. Okay, so they also incorporate their knowledge of a closed loop system to minimize waste and maximize efficiency. So you might recall we had discussed closed loops and open loops. So in an open loop system, pollution goes outside, it's not internalized. In a closed loop system, the waste becomes a resource. Waste does not become a pollutant. So it's about internalizing externalities to reduce overall pollution and exploitation of people. So how does the ISO then help developing countries? Well, it has an action plan, and what it does, here's a quote I took from them, from their code of ethics. It takes into account the development dimension. ISO parties shall contribute actions to help its members from developing countries improve their capacity and participation in international standards. So what that means is that they understand that that many developing nations don't have the expertise or the cost or the money involved to improve their capacity. So the ISO is taking those things into consideration. And the ISO states has also in their action plan for developing countries that sustainable development is not an objective that a country or region can pursue in isolation. So in other words, we need to work together. They understand the global connection of all countries. Okay, so the 5 main ISO objectives for ISO for developing countries. Sorry about that, I had to fix that one for you. Is to, number 1, improve the knowledge of stakeholders in developing countries. Second is improve, number 2, increase membership participation so they can help developing countries set priorities. 3, increase regional and national support in information exchange. Number 4, develop electronic communications to strengthen information infrastructure. And number 5, increase involvement of technical efforts to support participation within the policy making level. So that's about promoting democracy within the organization so that all voices are heard. Okay, so now let's move on to the next one, right? So that's a whole lot about the ISO. We're going to not spend as much time on these next 2. So the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, or WEEE. So this was adopted in February of 2003 by the European Community, which is part of the European Union, right? So that means the nations of Europe, except for England, which has been working on this Brexit deal. They want to no longer be part of the EU, and but you have the rest of Europe that are part of this. So nonetheless, the UK, the entire UK, is still beholden to the WEEE. Okay, so what does WEEE do? WEEE do? It requires that the 25 members of the EU to transpose the provisions of WEEE into national law. Because they understand that every country has its own laws, but by having these standards, and if everyone follows it, it makes it easier for everyone to do business with each other. Otherwise, you have independent nations with independent rules, and you can have 25 or more different rules and regulations that would affect these electronic products. So in August of 2005, about a year after the deadline, all of the states except for Malta and the UK met the deadline. And then it became law then in Europe, along with RoHS, which we'll discuss in just a moment. So along with the RoHS directive. And so what did it do? It set collection, recycling, and recovery targets for all types of electronic goods. And so all this was a result of this increased use of electronics. Now, for most of us, or many of you, electronics has perhaps always been part of your life. But I can tell you in my life, they weren't. Computers were developed in my lifetime, cell phones developed in my lifetime, iPods, tablets, laptops, on and on and on and on and on. Different types of televisions. Now we have these flat screen TVs, and all this stuff has been invented fairly recently, but it has all created much more toxic electronic e-waste. Okay, so the WEEE directive then imposes responsibility for the disposal of waste electrical and electronic equipment on the manufacturers. So the manufacturers are responsible, means they are responsible for closing the open loop, okay? Companies then establish the infrastructure for collecting materials that are listed under WEEE. So here's a quote for you. Users of electrical and electronic equipment from private households should have the possibility of returning WEEE at least free of charge. Sounds great, right? And you might be thinking, well, why don't we do that in the United States? Well, because we haven't acted on that yet. And hopefully, as we have more people being educated about this, more people that are socially and environmentally responsible, people like you, will begin to move our nation so that we actually do this, so we can reduce exploitation of people who are involved in actually collecting and recycling this. So companies then are compelled to use the collected waste in an ecologically friendly manner. So that basically means that they will take this material and they will reuse or refurbish some of it, and others gets recycled, meaning the components are melted down, chopped up, and then used to manufacture, used as a raw resource again to manufacture new electronic waste. Okay, so let's talk about RoHS. It's called the Restriction of Hazardous Substances Directive. So here's a very brief introduction to this. It was adopted in February of 2003, again by the European Community, which is part of the European Union. It became effective 3 years later in July of 2006, and each member was to adopt the RoHS law and then enforce it. It's closely linked to WEEE because it has the same duties about collection, recycling, recovery targets of electrical goods. And what RoHS does specifically, it restricts the use of 6 hazardous materials in the manufacture of various types of electronic and electrical equipment. So these 6 hazardous materials are lead, mercury, cadmium, hexavalent chromium, polybrominated biphenyls, which are in plastics, and polybrominated diphenyl ether. So these things are all very hazardous. So the idea here is to reduce these hazardous materials in products. Therefore, you have less exposure to people who use the products, less exposure to people who recycle those products. Okay, so why do we do it? Reducing toxic exposure. That's why. It's a high-tech toxicity problem. And so there's different options here. It's like you can have government that could then develop and enforce regulations on industry to internalize this externality or to not have it, or industry can act on its own without having to follow to the letter some government regulation. So this benefits industry because if you don't create a problem, you don't have to manage it. So as newer technology arrives, consumers discard obsolete products sooner than ever. So, some of you are probably, you got the new iPhone 3000 to replace your iPhone 2099 only because it's new. A lot of people that do that, they just buy the latest technology and are replacing things that don't need to be replaced yet. Because they haven't failed. And which, by the way, there are updates and things on products, and you would think that software companies and industry itself would develop software updates so you don't have to buy a new product. And so there's some pressure then for companies to consider that, and so that their product can have a continued use as opposed to it being out of date and then have to be discarded. Okay, so the stuff then that we end up consuming and becomes obsolete ends up being discarded, and the waste had been ending up in landfills and in countries like China and India, African nations, to be quote unquote recycled. But much of the stuff can't be recycled because there's no market for it. And so we saw a video on this early in the semester. And so I'd like to cover this now because it kind of closes the loop with the course. So in 2005, the EPA estimated that in the United States, between 1.5 and nearly 10 million tons of computers, TVs, VCRs. Do you remember those? Did you have a VCR? Did you watch video? Did you watch Disney films on a VCR? So there's also monitors, cell phones, and other equipment were discarded. If all the sources of electronic waste are tallied, it could total 50 million tons a year worldwide, according to the United Nations Environmental Program. So this is a massive amount of electronic things, of products that fairly new waste stream that needs to be managed. So it's I think it's a great thing that Europe stepped up to deal with this, and it's hard to find the words about how disappointing it is that the United States has not. American electronics, those things that you and I have had no longer use for, are sent offshore to countries like Ghana and West Africa and China and India as well, under this guise of recycling. Some of it gets recycled, but much of it does not. They actually burn some of this stuff, creating toxic air pollutants that then pollute people in those areas. So this could very well be doing more harm than good. I mean, that past practice. So this points out why RoHS is needed, is to reduce the pollution and toxic exposure of people in these countries. Okay, so it benefits then workers and recyclers. RoHS helps reduce damage to people and the environment in third world countries, where much of today's high-tech trash ends up. So the use of things like lead-free solders and components have provided immediate health benefits to the electronic industry workers as well. So you get benefits on both ends, people who produce the products and then people who discard the products or manage them at end of life. And so there's maximum permitted concentrations of some of these materials. Uh, um, and These limits don't apply to the weight of a finished product or even to a component. There's just limits in total. It can apply to any single substance within a product. And so, for example, the sheath on a cable or the tinning of a component. So you probably have a cable. Hopefully, you have a cable that connects that where your computer is connected, and the outside of it is that sheath that has the plastic coating there. So, for example, they had used cadmium in there because that helped with the flexibility of the cable. So this stuff has been taken out because it's got it's highly toxic. Don't chew your plastic cables. That's another lesson here. So there are other components where they are removing these toxic components and parts of like circuit boards and capacitors and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about the success of RoHS. Today, there's millions of products that are compliant with RoHS, and that's worldwide, including here in the United States. Most of today's consumer electronic products are now RoHS. So why would the U.S. want to be compliant? Well, because we sell a lot of products in Europe. And so if you want to sell in Europe, you have to be RoHS compliant. And because companies want to be efficient, they also sell those they sell those same products like in the United States. So if you're going to make it RoHS compliant for the EU, you might as well make it for everyone else. And so the overall compliance is up. Nonetheless, the U.S. could do better. So examples of RoHS compliant products include the iPod. Anybody have one of those? Music players, home computers from Dell and HP, servers, the Nintendo WEEE. I have one of those somewhere. Motorola and Nokia's wireless phones, Netgear routers, Panasonic television and appliances. There's many, many, many more. I can't list all of them, but I'm just trying to give you some examples. So many of these electronics companies also keep RoHS status pages on their corporate websites. And so here's one from AMD. I'll just read it to you. Although lead-containing solder cannot be completely eliminated from all applications today, AMD engineers have developed effective technical solutions to reduce lead content in microprocessors and chipsets to ensure RoHS compliance while minimizing cost and maintaining product features. There's no change to fit, functional, electrical, or performance specifications. Quality and reliability standards for RoHS compliant products are expected to be identical compared with the current packages. So that means that they've been able to make these changes with no impact to their product. So RoHS encouraged them to make these improvements, and therefore they did. So that's a good example of success. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about standards, environment, and global trade. So together, these organizations reduce pollution, resource consumption, and reduce pollution from the production and lightweighting of products. Less resource consumption happens in industry and trade, and what that does, it ultimately reduces environmental degradation and the loss of natural capital that is caused by industry and trade. And number 3 would be that the key goal here is to become more efficient with the use of natural resources. Number 4, this is a self-management tool to reduce ecological footprint. Now, it's not a complete solution to resource waste, but it is a serious solution to the problems of electronic waste. Okay, so we can use something similar to this on other types of products, right? So, for example, packaging, right? It would be great if we had a global standard on packaging, although we do have the dual system Deutschland in Germany, also known as the Green Dot, where industry has to take back the packaging that they create. And actually, when Germany created that program, it was then eventually adopted by the EU. There's a lecture on that. Okay, earlier in the course. So the benefits to business is that they improve their environmental performance, they reduce their liability in terms of getting sued for toxic exposure. So that's good. I think anything that creates less work for lawyers is good. It prevents pollution and promotes resource conservation. There's increased efficiency, reduced energy consumption, reduced costs related to energy consumption, and it enhances the image of the company with regulators and investors and the public to cost effectively gain credibility in the marketplace. So, for example, if you're buying stocks, and someday you probably will, or hopefully you will, you're not going to invest in a company that's going to have a bunch of toxic risk to users, because the company can be sued and then they can lose millions of dollars or even be shut down, as some industries have, because of their poor management of environmental issues. And with regulators, you don't want to draw attention to yourself. So it's better to not create the problem in the first place, so you don't have to get regulated and you don't have to spend money and time and effort to meet the needs of the regulators. Okay, so the outcome then is that, in particular, I want to point out something about developing countries, is that it's helped developing countries participate in production and to develop sustainable products. And it takes developing countries' interest into account. So it's great that that's what these ISO, RoHS, and WEEE all do. It takes developing interest into account on a global level, which allows for fair trade because they're all meeting the same standards. Regions then become more developed as they sell more products, they rise out of poverty, they create more jobs. World population, we think, is impacted, but it can slow. You don't need as many people. And ultimately, environmental impacts from industry and trade are minimized. So lots of positive benefits there. All right, so that's it for this one, and have a great day. Catch you all later.